Hi, Yinnies. Welcome back to a Yin Yoga podcast. If you are a familiar, if you're new around these parts, welcome to a Yin Yoga podcast. In the last few weeks, I've been getting a lot of feedback from y'all, the listeners who've been listening. And I must say, it just really warms my heart. I've been getting messages on Instagram, on Facebook, via email, et cetera, letting me know how much you're benefiting from these episodes and how much they're helping your teaching and the ahas that you've had. And it really warms my heart because that was my reason for creating this podcast, is that I knew I had a wealth of information and tips that I could give out for teachers. And I wanted to have a way to get them out into the world. So here we are. So thank you very much for letting me know that the podcast has been of benefit for you. Thank you for letting me know your specific ahas for those of you that have reached out. Super grateful for that. Keep them coming. It's always good to know when you're spending hours of your life creating something, and it is hours of your life. Anyone who has a podcast knows that it's working out, that people are benefiting. So thank you so much for that. If you're listening and you're like, wow, I haven't reached out, but I have been listening and I have been benefiting, then would you do me a solid? Just take a moment right now to pause this recording and go into whatever app you're listening or watching this on. So if you're watching on YouTube, if you could make sure you've subscribed to the channel, put a little thumbs up like under the video. And then partway through the episode, let me know what your ahas are. Let me know in the comments. What are your takeaways? If you are listening to this on Apple or Spotify, you could leave a 5-star review, and I would be uber grateful for that. And then on Apple, you also have the option to leave a written review. So if you'd like to do that, if you don't mind, just pause this right now, if this has been a benefit to you, and just take a moment to do that. And I will be so grateful. Seriously, I'll wait. Okay. Thank you very much. If you've already done that, if you're already like, I've already given a rating and a review and done all the things, then you could take a screenshot of this episode or your favorite and share it in your Instagram stories and tag me at Nick Danu Yoga or at Yin Yoga Podcast so that I can share the love. All right, my friends. I wanted to also share, before we get into today's topic, a little testimonial about my 60+ hour therapeutic Yin Yoga teacher training program, a little feedback that I've gotten. This is by Julie Chapman. The quality and the caliber of Nick as an instructor did not disappoint. I like that she offers a variety of ways to learn and that she herself has been created with her message throughout teaching the classes. The amount of information and resources was fantastic. I was on the edge of my seat the entire time. I have much enjoyed this training and all of the learning. I'm geeking out and searching out Yin Yang Theory. It has inspired me to learn more and apply it to my own life on a personal level, as well as my role as a teacher. Yin was new to me, but I'm hooked big time. I love not only being a student and learning, but also as a teacher. How would I put this into practice with my students? I'm already creatively thinking about how to incorporate and create new offerings. I appreciate Nick's style, which is approachable and full of information. I wouldn't change a thing. I also enjoyed that Nick is not only very informed and articulate teacher, but she adds humor to her presentation and instruction. Thank you, Julie. Yes, where would we be without humor? So that's a little bit about my 60-hour from somebody who's been through it. And if you are interested in taking a Yin training or an additional Yin training, because it is not unheard of at all to do more than one Yin training, and you want more information about mine, I would recommend getting on the wait list. And you can do that by clicking the link in the episode's notes that says get on the wait list. Just click that, And then once you're there, look way up to the top of the page. You're going to see a photo of me with some words and a button that you can push. And when you push that button to enter your name and email, you will not only get a free Yin Yoga sequence and a video, but you're also going to get little sneak peeks behind the scenes of my teacher training. I'll send out little snippets of lessons that I've done in the past, so you can get a little sampling of what we might be learning. You're going to get these podcast episodes in your inbox, and you're going to get access to some practice videos and also an invitation to my quarterly free class that happens. You'll get all of that when you're on the wait list. I send you lots of goodies along the way to when registration opens. And then when registration does open, then you're going to get first access, because I let the wait list know first before I open it up on social media or anywhere else. And you'll also get an early registration discount, which is good for the first 5 people that sign up. So all of that is only available when you're on the wait list. So again, if you're interested in joining the wait list, just look into the episode notes wherever you're watching this or listening to it, and there will be a link that says get on the wait list. And if you click that link and then look way up to the top of the page in the photograph of myself, you will see a button that you can push and enter your name and email, and bada bing, bada boom, you'll be there. Now, you should also check you'll have to confirm. So make sure you check your spam filter or your, promotions folder if you're on Gmail, to make sure that you actually confirm your registration, confirm that you've been added to the list. Okay. So with all of that in mind, just a reminder for those of you that are new around here or just need the reminder, although I have the soul of a mermaid, I also have the mouth of a sailor. So you can expect that there may be some adult language in this episode and that we will be discussing adult subject matter. So if you have small people around, please take a moment to grab headphones now. So today's topic is one that I've seen come up a lot in my classroom. So I see it a lot when I'm teaching, and I see it a lot with yoga teachers, Yin Yoga teachers, especially teachers that are teaching Yin that haven't really taken any Yin training or very much Yin training. Like if you took like a 20-hour or 30-hour training, that's not really enough to be, in my opinion, comfortable and qualified teaching Yin effectively and skillfully. And so I wanted to talk about this idea because not only do I see it come up in my classes with my students, and do I see it come up with teachers, both that I've taught in my teacher training and then just, in the Yogaverse on Facebook groups, etc. But I also think it's sort of rampant in our world in general. So today's topic is, are you teaching Yin Yoga with your Yang attitude? Are you teaching Yin Yoga with your Yang attitude? Now, if Yin and Yang are kind of new concepts to you, I did a whole episode on that, which I'll link so that you can listen to this in more in depth. But I want to just go over a little bit about Yin Yang as far as how it relates to yoga and just kind of to our world, and how we as teachers can notice when we as teachers are teaching our Yin Yoga with a Yang attitude, and then also notice it in our students. And what do we even do about that? Because discussing all of these things in theory isn't super helpful if we don't have sort of like a plan of what we can do to change that. So that's today's topic. Are you teaching Yin Yoga with your Yang attitude? So as we get into it, I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about some of the qualities of Yin and some of the qualities of Yang in general, and then kind of how they relate to yoga. And then I'll talk about some of the signs and symptoms that I see coming up in classes that may be familiar to you as well. Okay, so if we're talking about Yin, we could say, and remember, if you've listened to the other episode on Yin and Yang, I want to be really clear that nothing is 100% Yin, nothing is 100% Yang, that they rely on each other for their very definition. And so even though I'm about to give you lists of Yin and Yang qualities, please know these are philosophical concepts that vary depending on what you're comparing them to. Okay, so let's get that out of the way. So yin-like qualities: dark, quiet, yielding, being introverted, interoception, which I did another whole episode on, and loosely translated or briefly translated, interoception is an awareness of what is happening inside of you. Going inward, being still, the earth, the water element, the metal element, the moon, nighttime, winter and fall, heavy, downward, passive, cold. So those are yin qualities. Yang qualities: bright, boisterous, advancing, extroverted, outward, active, the sky, the fire element, the wood element, the sun, daytime, spring and summer, light, upward, dynamic, hot. So those are just some of the qualities of yin and yang. And then let's put this in the framework of yoga. So yang forms of yoga have these common characteristics, whether they are as gentle as a hatha or whether they're as strong as an ashtanga or a hot practice. They do have these things in common: movement, repetition. There's a feeling of striving or efforting, strengthening, effort, the sun. And in fact, they often include sun salutations. Proprioception, flow, an increase in heart rate. They're more structured. There's more of a focus on aesthetics, meaning what does it look like? They're achievement-based and goal-orientated. They're bright, expansive. There's more of a focus on evolution, of progressing. There's warmth and heat. Whereas the qualities of yin yoga are stillness, quiet, cool, surrender, involution, so going inside, opening, softness, interoception, again, awareness of what's happening inside of you, function. They're more freeform, less structured. They're connected to the moon, dark, and singular. So we're not repeating the same movement over and over. We don't have that repetition. So those are just kind of a little bit of a review for those of you who are familiar with this. And for those of you that haven't checked out the Yin Yang episode, again, you can do that later. I'll put it in the show notes. But I wanted to review that because I think that sometimes what happens is that people bring their yang attitude into their yin practice. In fact, I know they do. And sometimes this is because they're brand new to the practice of yin, but sometimes it's actually just that they really have trouble letting go, or maybe they're a real A-type personality. And so what you can see sometimes in a yin class, so I'll talk about the students first, then I'm going to talk about how teachers encourage this in their practice. So you might see a student, sort of really pushing themselves physically in the pose, trying to do like 100% of what they can. They're sort of white knuckling it. They're treating their yin yoga class like it's a gym workout. They're pushing, they're efforting, they're striving, their veins are bulging, their face is turning red, they're white knuckling it. I see this the most often in seated forward folds, whether it's butterfly or half butterfly or any of the seated forward bends, caterpillar. Somewhere in the Yogaverse, students have gotten the idea that the way to do that pose, I'm doing air quotes here for those of you who can't see me, correctly, is that eventually your hands must grab your foot. And so they will do all kinds of contorted, uncomfortable, stressful things to their body just to make their hands touch their feet. So I like to remind my students that enlightenment is not attached to their feet. That in fact, in a yin practice, I would rather them not try to reach their feet. Instead, I would like them to hinge forward at their hips and then soften their spine and then just let their hands fall wherever they fall, right under their shoulders. That it is, in fact, the heart coming forward over the legs. That is the point of that pose, not whether or not their hands ever reach their foot. And for some people, even their heart coming over their legs is going to be ambitious. So when we can teach our students that the point of a yin practice isn't to, air quotes, get the full pose someday, but that instead, let's just use half butterfly as an example. If I can get it across to my students that actually the point of this pose isn't for you to reach your foot with your hands. Instead, because yin yoga is a functional form of yoga, not an aesthetic yoga, meaning it's what does the pose feel like that's important, not what does the pose look like. In yin, we don't care what the pose looks like. We want to know, are you feeling sensation or stretch in the intended area? And if so, well done. So for example, let's just use half butterfly as an example. For those of you who don't speak yin, that would be Janu Shirshasana. So in that shape, if the goal isn't to get your hands to your foot, which by the way, unless my Sanskrit is off from my first training, Janu Shirshasana actually means head to knee pose. So hands to the foot, not even mentioned in the title. But for some reason, our students, and maybe even yourself, dear teacher listening to this, are obsessed with holding our feet. So I like to mention to the students that the point of this pose is not actually to hold your foot, that whether your hands ever touch your foot is completely irrelevant to the pose. Instead, what is important is, are you feeling a sensation of stretch in that 50 to 60% range in the back of your leg? If you're tight in your hamstrings, that's where it'll be. Or for those that are more open in their hamstrings, they might be feeling it through their spine as they bend forward. That's the point of the pose. Not to get your hand to your foot, not to do some advanced air quotes version of the pose. I did a whole episode on that too, on what is advanced yoga. So I can link that in the show notes. But that is not the point of the pose. And if the student is new to yin, or if you as a teacher are new to teaching yin, this might be news to you. You might be thinking, oh, wait, what? There's no goal pose? I don't need to be pushing and striving and efforting to get somewhere? No, you do not. Yin is more about surrender and acceptance than it is about efforting and striving. So it shows up in class a lot. Now, I mentioned forward folds, not because that's the only time it'll show up. It'll show up sometimes in back bends too, where people push themselves up into seal when really they're still better served down in Sphinx pose, because they think that that means they're advancing or progressing in their practice. Funny story, even with teachers. So one of the studios that I teach at, we were doing a photo shoot for the studio. And when it came up time for me to come up to the front of the room and teach, I taught a pose for the photo shoot. It wasn't a real class. I taught Sphinx. And then at the end of it, I said, and for those of you who it's easily available, if you want to straighten your arms and come into seal, please do. And every single yoga teacher in that group, other than one, pushed their arms straight. Even though I could tell just from looking at them that that wasn't the best version for a lot of them, actually. So even with yoga teachers, there's this idea in our heads that, like, practice, practice, and all is coming, which has got to be the stupidest quote. Practice, practice, and all is coming. That if you just keep practicing, you too will be able to do the air quotes full version of this pose. So this is the water we're swimming in as yoga teachers and as yoga practitioners. This is what we've been told and taught to believe, that if we just keep practicing these shapes, the asana with our body, that one day we too will do that version of the pose that is in the yoga book. And anyone who's, studied the work of Paul Grilley and understands skeletal variations, not to mention body proportions, issues, injuries, et cetera, will know that that's a bunch of bullshit. That is not the case. Not everybody will be able to do every pose, period, the end, full stop. And it's not because they aren't dedicated, and it's not because they're not practicing enough yoga. It's because we all have different bodies. So what might be easily available to me might be impossible for my neighbor, and vice versa. So when we teach from that lens of each of my students is an individual who has their own personal expression of their own bone structure, and then not to mention, postural habits, sports that they're involved in, previous injuries, etc., body proportions, that none of my students are going to look the same in this pose. So what we need to watch then as a teacher is not to cue it that way. So if you are cueing your pose by saying, for example, let's just use half butterfly again, fold forward, and if you can, reach for your foot. Well, no wonder you've got a bunch of people striving to reach their foot when that's not at all appropriate for them, for their level of flexibility that day or ever, who knows? So it starts sometimes with us. And I just want to tease out that, I'm talking specifically about yin here, but please know, dear teacher, for those of you that teach other styles of yoga, you can actually start teaching all of your classes from a functional perspective instead of an aesthetic perspective. You can start teaching your flow classes, your hatha classes, whatever classes you teach, from the point of view of this is the reason we're doing this pose, instead of this is what this pose should look like. Because part of the reason people enter the yin space and are white knuckling it and sweating bullets and their veins are bulging and they're furrowing their eyebrows and their face is turning red and they're doing all of that in yin is because they were encouraged somewhere else to do that, whether it be in a different style of yoga or a gym or wherever it was. And so now as a teacher, I'm having to undo that habit. I'm having to explain to them why that's actually not skillful. Whereas if we all just taught functionally, oh, that would be a dream if we all taught yoga functionally. Then they would understand that the reason I've sequenced this pose here is perhaps to stretch your hamstring. Or maybe it's because forward bends tend to be soothing to the nervous system, or et cetera, et cetera. So as a teacher, if you can start to plug into your classes why you're doing what you're doing, instead of what the pose should look like, or what the correct air quotes alignment is, because there's no one alignment for everybody. If you can start to shift all of your teaching over to the reason I'm putting this pose in the sequence here is for this reason. You have to know it yourself, first of all. And just because it's fun probably isn't a good enough reason. Although, it could be. We all need a little more play in our lives. But when you know that, okay, I've sequenced this forward fold in the practice here because I want them to feel some sensation of stretch in their hamstring. I know that forward bends are sort of down regulating, nourishing postures. So good things to do to start to wind a class down, perhaps to relax. I know that if a student folds forward in this way, that they're also moving their spine through one of the key directions of the spine, and they may even be stretching the tissues and the fascia of their back. So you can see how I just broke down a forward bend and said a few reasons why we might be doing that forward bend. When you can do that as a teacher, then you can pass that on to your students. Oh, by the way, did you know that the point actually of me putting this forward bend in is because forward folds help to soothe the nervous system? And so that's why I've sequenced it here. So if you're not feeling relaxed in this pose, you're kind of missing the point. See what I did there? I just turned the point of the pose into the function. So now that students can, with some encouragement, perhaps for you, and it might take repetitive encouragement from you, they can soften that reaching and striving for their foot and the veins bulging and the white knuckling and all of that, because now they're like, oh, so the point of this pose is for me to relax. This is to help nourish my nervous system. The point of this pose isn't to grab my foot. Oh, this is probably going to be the first time they've ever heard that. This might be the first time you've considered that as a teacher. So when we can stop teaching these poses as this is what we do to get to the air quotes full pose, and start teaching the poses from this is the function of the pose. This is what this pose is especially good at. And this is why I've put it in the sequence. Then our students learn, and we also learn. So you can start doing functional yoga in any style of yoga. I'm going to talk about yin specifically because that's what this podcast is about. But just know that all of the things that I'm saying here, almost all of them, at least as far as the inner attitude, could be taken into a more movement-based practice. Okay. So sometimes it's because the student has heard these things in a different style of yoga. They've heard that the goal of this pose is to someday reach my foot, or if I just practice long enough, one day my hamstrings too will be long enough, loose enough, whatever they're thinking, so that I can grab my foot. And so they're pushing and efforting and striving to get there before their body's ready, because they think that that's what they need to do to reach their goal, right? That's what we need to do to reach our goals, isn't it? Isn't that what we've all been taught? Not just in yoga, but in life. So this is where it comes into our yang attitude in the world, not just the yogaverse, but in our culture, and how it seeps in and infects our yoga. So when we live in a culture where being productive is praised above all else, where we are constantly encouraged to push, to strive, to evolve, to climb the corporate ladder, to break through a glass ceiling, to make more, do more, earn more, be more, etc., over and over and over again on repeat. It starts in school and it just continues. When we believe that our worth as humans is being a contributing citizen financially in a predatory capitalist system. I'm not anti-capitalist, but I am anti the way it is right now. Predatory capitalism is very different than what it was intended to be. And so when we've been taught that this is how we are valued as a human, right? By how much we produce, how hard we work, how much we advance, how many of our goals we conquer. I mean, even just look at our language, right? Hustle, got to hustle. People are slaying things. People are crushing things. This is all yang dominant. All of these things that I'm saying, this is yang energy. Now, don't get me wrong. We need yang energy. If we didn't have yang energy, we would still be living in caves shivering because we would not have developed fire, right? But anything, no matter how good it is, if it goes too far, which it has, in case you haven't noticed, our society's not functioning so well, our planet's kind of struggling. This would be a sign of a yang imbalance globally, more so in our sort of air quotes Western cultures, particularly North America, but also Europe as well. This efforting, pushing, striving, competing, you're not worthy unless you are hustling and pushing and go, 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 keeping up with the Joneses, breaking the glass ceiling, getting the promotion, all of this. None of that will make you happy on your deathbed, by the way. But that's, sidebar. But when we're brought up in this culture, then it's no wonder that, of course, we bring this attitude into our yoga practice, whether that's your personal practice or into your classes that you're teaching, regardless of style. And, I was raised in that culture as well. I mean, don't get me wrong. I used to have goal poses on my vision board at a time when I was a new teacher. I do not anymore. But when we bring all of that energy, all of that subconscious programming, all of those messages that we've been taught about our culture, ourselves, and our value and our worth in the world, and then we bring that into a yoga class, now we got a problem, especially if it's a yin class. Because in a yin practice, we're not trying to strive and push and be some complete air quotes version of a pose. We're trying to slow down. We're trying to drop in to ourselves. We're trying to practice interoception, noticing what is happening inside of me. And so really, we need to leave all of that other bullshit at the door. All of the yang dominance that we have in our culture, we need to leave that at the door for yin. I'm not saying that's easy to do for students. I'll give you some tips on that, of course. I want this, of course, to be practical for you as well. I don't want to just soapbox and then leave you stranded with like no actual tangible things that you can do. I will share those, of course. But first, I think we need to understand the why before we can work on the how. So this is why we or our students both have these attitudes. And they're so subconscious that you might not even notice that you're bringing them into your teaching. Here is an example of it. When you teach and demonstrate a pose, and you teach the, air quotes again, advanced version, and you show that version first, and then you show how people can modify it with props. And most teachers teach this way. Think about what you're doing there. You're buying into this yang dominance that the whole point is, oh, well, here's the goal, everybody. Here's the air quotes full pose, the advanced pose. But I mean, if you can't do that today, here's some things you can do with prompts. So it starts with something as simple as that. We are giving our students the idea that the point of this practice is to get to that goal. And so they will do all kinds of funky shit with their body to get there. And this can lead to injuries. It's also not good for our nervous systems. So if you're not going to teach your more active classes in a different way, which I really dream that most teachers will at some point, but if you aren't, can we at least leave all that shit at the door when we're teaching our yin classes, please? Because again, remember, yin is about softness, surrender, yielding, introspection, rest, stillness, quiet. Those are our yin qualities. So we want to leave all of that yang stuff kind of at the door. Now, of course, your students are going to walk in the room with all this yang stuff, right? Because they may never have done yin, or they're just, we're literally bathed in it from the time we pop out of the womb. And then if they've done other styles of yoga where they've been told that there's a goal pose and a complete pose, and that just if you keep practicing, one day you too will wrap your foot behind your head. If they've been told that, well, no wonder they come into the yin room with that attitude. So then it's our job as yin teachers to start to tease that apart, to start to knock some of the legs of that table off so that they can settle and they can actually receive the true benefits of yin. So one way that I think is super important to do that, and one way that I do this, and I do this in all classes, by the way, not just yin. So you'll notice a little while ago, I said that most teachers teach the strongest version of a pose that they can do. And then they show some air quotes modifications with props. What if you reverse that? Especially in a yin group, but I'd actually like to see it in all classes. I do it in all my classes. So I actually start with the softest version of a pose, or the air quotes easiest version. I show them that, and then I show them how to add challenge if they need it. And most of them don't. So, for example, let's use the same pose, forward bend. If I was teaching that in a yin way, here's what I would do. I would get them to come into the shape, one leg straight out in front of them, the other one bent. If their bent knee doesn't reach the earth naturally, comfortably, which it doesn't for a lot of people, I would encourage them to stick a prop under that so that they're coming from a grounded place on both legs. Then I encourage them to reach their arms up and get really, really long, to keep their arms up, to hinge from their hips, to fold over their leg, and then just to let their arms fall wherever they are and gently let the spine round if that's appropriate for them. For some people, letting their spine round is not appropriate based on certain back conditions. So, if it's not appropriate for them, I will encourage them to keep their spine a little flatter, a little longer, just slightly more engaged. That's a whole lesson in itself. So we'll skip over that for now. But you'll notice I didn't say anything about touching their foot. I didn't say anything about bringing their hands to their leg. Now, they will still try. unless they're brand new to yoga, because somewhere in gym class or some other yoga class or somewhere they've been taught that the point of this pose is to touch your foot. And so I like to use humor. So I'll often just say, did you know that the point of this pose is actually not to reach your foot? The point of this pose is, and then I will tell them the function of the pose. Here's why I have put this pose in the sequence, so that you can perhaps feel a stretch in your hamstring or your back, and that it's down regulating nervous system wise, that this is going to be a pose that helps to wind us down. That's why I put this pose in the sequence. So reaching your foot is irrelevant. And in fact, unless you absolutely can't feel a stretch in this at all without touching your foot, I highly recommend you don't try to touch your foot. That instead, you just let your spine gently round forward and let your arms fall wherever they are, under your shoulders, maybe even turning your palms up. So there's more sense of softness and surrender. So I address the elephant in the room. Stop trying to reach your damn foot. It's not the point of this pose. I don't say it like that. I don't say stop trying to reach your damn foot. You get my point. I tell them what the point of the pose is, and I encourage them to let go. Now, here's the other thing that will happen, because in some styles of yoga, in that pose, when you can't reach your foot, you use a strap. And there's nothing wrong with that if you're doing a more active practice. But trying to hold on to a strap for, let's say, 5 minutes is going to cause tension in the body. And again, they're going to be efforting and pulling themselves forward into the shape because they think the goal is to touch their foot. So although a strap can be a useful prop, I do not use them in seated forward folds, because when students pick up that strap, they start to do their yin yoga with their yang attitude again. They're pulling on the strap, they're holding the strap, which is causing tension in their hands, forearms, upper arms, shoulders, upper back, and neck, right? Just because they're efforting. And it might be subtle, but it is there. So even with that, I encourage them, you know what? Since the goal is not to reach your foot here, what if we just let go of the strap? What if we just fold it forward to whatever degree our body will allow us to do today? And then we just took a deep breath and softened into gravity, right? We just let gravity have us here. And that is a way to do that pose in a yin way. And of course, there's all kinds of other prop variations I could include there to get people more comfortable. That, won't go into that in the podcast because those kinds of things don't go over that well in an audio format. But yes, I could add bolsters and all the things, but my point is that my intention is to get them to understand that the point of this pose is not to, air quotes, do the full pose one day. That the point of the pose actually is to feel this in your body or this in your body, or maybe you're going for the energetic effects of the pose. For example, in the forward folds tend to bring the energy down. They're good for the nervous system, blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. And you may have to say something repeatedly, because there are those A-type students out there, the ones. I used to be one, who are going to constantly push themselves, despite the fact that you have just said the point of the pose isn't to do this, blah, blah, blah. So what do we do about them? What do we do about those die-hard, sort of A-type people that just keep pushing no matter what you say? I have a few ideas on that. So one idea for that is what we just went over, explaining to them that that is not the point of the pose. That the point of the pose is, and then give them the functional reasons that you've inserted the pose. Another is to address it with humor, which is what I tend to do. I always say something like, did you know that enlightenment is not attached to your foot? I use myself as an example in that exact pose, half butterfly, when I was, quite a bit tighter and I, just could never touch my foot. And then finally I went to a yoga workshop where we worked on a bunch of forward folds, and lo and behold, at the end, I could fold forward and I could actually touch my foot with my hands without it being painful. And I was immediately disappointed that nothing else changed. I wasn't enlightened. I wasn't a nicer person. My stress levels hadn't lowered. I wasn't healthier. Nothing changed. So sometimes using humor, right? Or I'll say things like, by the way, there's no trophy or no gold star for touching your foot in this pose. And then I'll remind them. So usually after a couple of those kinds of reminders, people will soften a bit. But sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes they just keep pushing. Another thing you can do is you can actually talk about how a yin practice is different as far as what kinds of tissues in the body we're trying to access. And that yin is especially good for fascia and large bands of connective tissues, particularly deep fascia. And did you know that this kind of tissue actually doesn't respond the same way as muscle would? Now, of course, we can't totally separate fascia and muscle. That's impossible because fascia surrounds every muscle, every segment, every compartment, et cetera, et cetera. But for simplicity's sake, you can say, that deep fascia actually doesn't respond to strong amounts of effort. That if you're trying to strengthen a muscle, you do want to push yourself a little, right? Like if you're doing a bicep curl, you want to take enough weight and do enough of those reps that like you're going to exhaust yourself because you're trying to build strength. But if we're trying to address our fascia or increase our flexibility or just rest, then none of those things apply. And that actually backing away, maybe into that, I always say 50 to 60% range, and then settling in there and waiting to see if the tissue starts to yield and soften. And if the sensation does go away, then maybe you go a little further. It may not go away. But that these sturdy, denser tissues do not respond the same way. So that actually, when you're pushing and striving and trying to do more, you're going to get less benefit because the fascia will not respond that way. What's going to happen instead is the nervous system is going to start to move into fight, flight, or freeze response because it senses that you're pushing it and that an injury may happen. And so it's going to tense up. So if you're pushing and striving to reach your foot in a seated forward fold, your body is actually going to start to tighten. That's the opposite of what we want. So explain to them with humor and then also with the science. Like for those students that really need to know the logical reasons, give them a reason. And then it's rare, but it's happened a couple of times. Sometimes I will say something like, I usually tend to stay on my mat for most of the yin practice because A, I'm a trauma-informed teacher, and B, I'm not offering hands-on adjusts in yin. That wouldn't be appropriate. But what I will do sometimes if I see that somebody's still really struggling with this idea that like they need to do this version of the pose, or they're really uncomfortable, they're sort of white knuckling it through their practices, I may say to the group, I'm just going to move around the room to help some of your yoga friends get more comfortable. And I'm going to offer some ideas with props or different versions of poses. And if these don't make you more comfortable, please ignore me and do what you were doing. And then I'll walk over to people that are white knuckling it. And I'll just say, hey, what would happen if you actually let your hands go here? Or what would happen if maybe you grabbed a bolster or a block here? Instead of trying to reach for your foot, maybe you could grab a prop and settle into that. Or you could let your hands just go to the ground and turn your palms up. I'm using the same half butterfly example. What would happen if you tried that? Try that. Let me know how it goes. So I'm actually going to address it verbally to the whole group a few times, but then if I still see that real pushing, I'm going to go over and address it, but in a soft way. Just going to say, hey, I'm curious. Have you thought about this? One time when teaching a class, and it took me a while to get to her because it was a very full class, I had a student who was new to me, new to Yin, and she just was, again, pushing, striving, grunting, efforting through everything. And so I did all of these verbal cues, all of these, that's not the point of yin. I often will even crack a joke and say, hey, are you doing your yin yoga with your yang attitude? And then I'll describe some of the yang qualities: pushing, striving, efforting, competing, more. And they'll say things like, more isn't always better. It's just more. So I had already done that, for example, with this one woman. And she just was not going to let go. She was so struggling and suffering. And it was all self-induced, all because she wouldn't let herself soften or take a prop. And so with her, and this was just instinct, I just went over to her and I whispered in her ear, what would happen if you gave yourself permission to do less? What would that feel like in your practice? And she immediately softened and immediately started doing less and immediately grabbed a prop that I had been mentioning. And then after class, thanked me because she really enjoyed the class and she felt so relaxed afterwards. So sometimes these habits that we maybe as teachers have, if you are a real yang dominant person, or the students have, are tricky to sort of leave at the door. But we need to leave them at the door when we're in a yin class. If somebody is trying to do their full pose and they're white knuckling it and they're furrowing their eyebrows and their breath isn't smooth and calm and even, and they're gritting their teeth and all of this is happening, and then they're holding that for minutes at a time, you are not creating a fan of the yin yoga there, I'll tell you that. They are not going to enjoy that. They are not going to want to come back. So your job, if you're a teacher, is to skillfully guide them into the knowledge that there is another way to practice this. That perhaps they could take some softness, some yielding, some surrendering. That maybe they could let gravity do the work for them in the pose. Maybe they could use props where appropriate so that they could take a deep breath and sigh and soften into it so that they're not engaging all of their muscles to hold themselves into the shape. So in a yin practice, we want to do as little muscular effort as possible to hold on to the shape, to maintain the pose. So sometimes we do have to use some of our muscles to make the shape, but we want to try to let everything else soften if possible. So if you're a yoga teacher and you're listening to this, I would be curious, and you should do some reflection and let me know how it goes. Get at me at Instagram or wherever and let me know how it goes. If you know now that I've been mentioning this, that you have maybe not consciously, but maybe you've been teaching your yoga classes, not just your yin classes, but maybe all your classes, with this yang dominant attitude of like, this is the full pose. This is the goal. We must get to the full pose and everybody can do the full pose. And you just have to keep practicing. And one day you too will be able to do this full version of the pose. If you actually believe that is true, you really need to educate yourself. And I would highly recommend Anatomy for Yoga by Paul Grilley. It is linked in the show notes always. So click on that. It was a DVD. Now it's an online streaming presentation. Please watch that. If you have not, any teacher listening to this, if you have not watched that, it is the number one thing that I recommend to all yoga teachers. Anatomy for Yoga by Paul Grilley. It is linked in the episode notes because your mind will be blown and you will truly learn how to be of service to your students. There is no one size fits all here. So if you started listening to this episode and you're like, whoa, wait, this is news to me, please seek out that resource. It is, I've watched it numerous times. Every time I have a new aha, it's required watching for my teacher training. All of the people that sign up for my teacher training have to watch that and answer reflection questions. It's their first assignment. So cannot stress enough how valuable that is. And it's not just yin related. In fact, some of the poses he shows aren't yin poses at all. They're regular yoga poses from hatha or whatever tradition. But you really need to broaden your horizons if you think that practice and all is coming, or that eventually everybody will be able to do all these poses, because you could be teaching your classes from a place of actually injuring your students or your own body. If you believe that, you're also going to be hurting your own body. So that little soapbox aside, can we as teachers raise the bar for ourselves? And can we start to practice functionally? Why am I putting this pose into the sequence? What are the benefits of this pose? Why did I put it here? And then communicating that to your students. So if you can even start doing that in your more active classes, it'll be much easier in your yin classes. But if you're not going to do it in your active classes, even though I'm strongly encouraging you to start, then at least for God's sake, please do it in your yin classes. We have to encourage and teach our students that the point of our yin poses isn't to get anywhere. The point of our yin poses isn't to get to the full pose, the advanced pose. That we're not all trying to do some idealized version in a picture of these shapes. That is not the point at all. The point instead is, I want to feel some sensation in my body in this pose to a tolerable degree. And if they don't feel sensation in their body because they're maybe quite flexible and they've come to the range of their bone structure, well, then there's a whole bunch of other benefits for their nervous system, for their mind, et cetera, et cetera. And I've done lots of episodes on those, so I won't get into that here. But this is how we, as yoga teachers, can help our students so that they're not practicing their yin yoga with their yang attitude. Where maybe we, even as teachers, can start practicing our yoga with a more yin-like attitude. We're in a yang dominant culture. We're in a dysfunctionally yang dominant culture. Because again, there's nothing wrong with yang energy. It's necessary. But we are in a state of disharmony with it. It's all yang all the time. It's no wonder that people are suffering from so many stress-related diseases, which is pretty much all of them. Because our culture has set us up to push, to effort, to strive, to compete, to be more, to do more, to be better, to hustle, to keep up with the Joneses, to break through the glass ceiling, to crush it, etc., etc. And these yin-like qualities of being curious, being open, being receptive, being still, practicing interoception, meditating, listening to our hearts, dropping inward. These are not prized and praised in our culture. And we are suffering for it. We personally, as humans and the whole planet, are suffering because of this excess yang. So when there's an excess of yang, what we need to bring in to harmonize that is more yin. And we can do that in our classes. And then hopefully our students, when they learn in our classes, oh, wow, this feels really great. Maybe this yin attitude will start to infiltrate the rest of their life. Maybe they'll realize that actually a walk outside might be better than pushing myself through one more thing that's supposed to make me a better human. Maybe they'll take more time to sit and be quiet and listen, to be curious, to be open. We can dream, right? I actually know this happens because my students have told me that when we can skillfully teach these things in the yin room or in the yoga space, that they leave with our students and they go out into the world when they're off their yoga mat with these same qualities, these same ahas, and these same new skills. So I think to summarize, we'll leave it there and I'll just summarize that because our students are coming into our yin classes with this yang dominant attitude from the world that we live in, from what we've all been taught to believe from day one when we come out of the womb, that they come in with these unconscious beliefs, this efforting, this striving, right? This is natural because we've all been reared in it. And so how we skillfully as a teacher can navigate that and negotiate that and encourage them to do something else, something more yin-like. Well, I've given you a bunch of tips here on how you can do that. Both in how you can present the teachings, because you might be unconsciously reinforcing those stereotypes, right? Not knowing, because you too were raised and immersed in a culture where this was prized, but that you too might be actually encouraging this attitude without knowing it. The one example I gave of always showing the strongest version of a pose first and then showing modifications, air quotes, for people who can't do the air quotes full pose. That's one example of how you are bringing this in to your rooms. Another example that I've seen yin teachers do, I'll give you two more, is that they encourage movement in between the poses. And I've already done a whole episode on the rebound, on honoring the rebound. You can listen to that if you want more on that. But when you're encouraging your students that instead of gently and softly coming into a pose and kind of settling into a rest shape, when instead of doing that, you're telling them to come into another yoga pose like cat cow or downward dog or something like that and move, you're taking away that yin time. So you might be doing that and not realize that that too is yang dominant, right? Movement is yang. Those are a couple of ways that we can accidentally bring these things in. Another way that I've heard teachers do, and this especially comes from teachers that were first trained in vinyasa, is they get people partway into the pose, and then they'll say something like, take a deep breath. And if you feel like you can now go a little further on your exhale, go further. I think that is also problematic. Most students are going to go further if they feel like they can go further without you telling them to. But what happens when you do that is now the students that actually probably shouldn't be going further feel like they should be going further, air quotes, should be going further now because they're partway through the pose and things should have opened. So, oh, well, they didn't. Okay, well, I'm just going to go further anyways. Okay, so that's another thing that I see yin teachers bringing in active breath techniques from other styles of yoga that are not down regulating, that are not soothing, nourishing breaths for the nervous system. So bringing in breath work that's designed to stimulate, to energize in a yin practice, bad move, big mistake. Leave those for your more active practices if you're qualified to train teachers, or if you're qualified to teach those forms of breath. So those are some of the ways that I've witnessed teachers bring their yang attitude, consciously or unconsciously, into their yin practice. So that's how we as teachers can raise the bar on these things. We can let those attitudes go at the door when we show up for a yin practice. And then as students, we can encourage them, again, sometimes with humor, by how we guide them into the pose. Notice what words you're using. Are you saying, and see if you can reach your foot? Do you need to say that? Nope, you certainly don't. How can you say these things in a way that encourages softness and yielding and surrender? And then when you notice that students are white knuckling in it, that they're struggling, that they're suffering, et cetera, then you can use humor. You can guide them on what the point of the pose actually is. Like the point of doing this is a functional pose. This is why we're doing it. So, touching your foot in a forward fold, irrelevant, right? Because this is actually why we're doing it. You can explain to them that in yin, we're working with fascia, which doesn't respond the same way that muscle is. So by actually pushing and striving, you're actually not doing what you think you're doing. You're not getting more flexible because your body's tightening up, because it's moving into our sympathetic nervous system, the fight, flight, or freeze response. So you can explain that. You can encourage the use of props where appropriate, whether that be to the whole group or whether that be to an individual student. So those are just some of the ways that you as a teacher can leave your perhaps unconscious yang dominant attitude. And again, none of us are doing this consciously, but now that you've heard me talk about them, you might be like, oh shit, I've done some of those, right? So now that you know, how can you alter maybe the way that you teach this practice so that it is a yin dominant practice? What words can you use to help your students when they're A-typing it through their poses, when they're white knuckling it and struggling? Can you offer prop solutions? Can you tell them why it's important to soften, to surrender, to yield? These are all things that you can do. So yang has its place, yin has its place. They harmonize each other, ideally. But because we are in a yang dominant world where we do not get nearly enough yin, it's even more important that when somebody shows up for some yin time, that we really try to make it as yin-like as possible, as a way to harmonize the world out there, outside of the yoga room doors, where everything is all about yang. So I will leave you with what I believe is that what the world needs now is yin, sweet yin, not just in our yin classes, but in the wide world out there as well. I hope that you found this helpful. Whether you're a practitioner or a teacher, I hope you got some nuggets here. And with that, I'll let you go until we Okay, I hope that you found this helpful, whether it's for your own practice or for your teaching. I hope there were some nuggets here that you can use, tangible things. Let me know if there is. Like, please reach out. You can find me easily on Instagram at Nick Danu Yoga or at Yin Yoga Podcast. I'm also on Facebook, but I don't tend to hang out there as much. So Instagram is probably better unless you don't have Facebook. Or if you only have Facebook, then you can find me on Facebook as Nick Danu. So yeah, I hope that you found this helpful. Let me know if there was any little ahas, any little nuggets of information that stood out to you. Let me know how this goes. If you start practicing some of these ideas, I would love to hear from you. And until then, until we meet again, bye for now.